The presence of Jeremy Lent as the opening keynote speaker for this anniversary conference is significant for two reasons. The first is his role as a globally leading scholar on ecological civilization. I'll return to that role in a moment, but Jeremy's importance goes far beyond that for a second reason. 10 years ago, when the big conference ended, John Cobb suggested that we form an organization to carry on the work, to advance the theory and practice of ecological civilization. So in 2015, Andrew and I launched the Institute for Ecological Civilization, or Ecociv. Since then, we've been active in 13 countries. One branch of the work was theoretical. What are the major features of this kind of civilization? How do we get there? We held major conferences in Asia, Europe, South America, North America. We also worked practically to support communities that were actually making that transition around the world. So, for example, we worked in 6 African countries with sustainable agricultural practices and access to water. Today, it's my pleasure to announce the next chapter in that work. I'm retiring as president, and the Ecociv board has just voted unanimously to invite Jeremy Lent to serve as the acting president of Ecociv, now working under a new name, the Ecocivilization Coalition. Jeremy and his team are founding a new global coalition of communities and organizations who are bringing about the transition to this sort of a civilization. Perhaps Jeremy will say more about this in his talk. This is a fantastic combination of Jeremy's theory and his practical work. So let me close with his scholarship. Jeremy's work investigates the underlying causes of our civilization's existential crisis. It explores pathways toward a life-affirming future. Jeremy wrote the award-winning book, The Patterning Instinct, about humanity's search for meaning. And more recently, he published another award-winning book, The Web of Meaning, integrating science and traditional wisdom to find our place in the universe. And this book lays out an integrative worldview that can lead humanity to a sustainable, flourishing future. Jeremy's written extensively about the vision and specifics of an ecological civilization. He's the founder of the Deep Transformation Network, which I encourage you to join, a global community. And he's now about to publish the 3rd book in his trilogy. It has the title, Reclaim Our Future: How We Can Make a World That Works for All. Watch for that, published by Melville House early next year. Please welcome new incoming president of the Ecocivilization Coalition, Jeremy Lent.
All right. Well, Philip, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Really appreciate it, and absolutely appreciate this opportunity to share some of the thinking that I hope will be central to this next phase of Ecociv that Philip talked about, and of this to be renamed coalition that we are starting to build to try to really have an impact on the long-term future of where our total global civilization is headed, which is, I think, what we're all about with this vision. So, yeah, so I'm going to share with you a prepared presentation about essentially what this is called, envisioning an ecological civilization in theory and practice, like how we can actually make a world that works for all. And I'd like to, and in fact, after I've given this formal part of this presentation, I hope we'll have time for some Q&A and some just interactive conversation about what ideas came to you from this, any questions you have, and reflections on where this might lead. So I'd like to actually begin really with the big picture. And just to kind of go back to what Sharon was just saying a few moments ago, this is our Earth, our only home. Here in the middle of this big, vast darkness, and we now know there's like hundreds of millions of galaxies all around this universe, but we don't yet know of any other place where life exists in this incredibly vast universe other than this beautiful little jewel of a planet. And it was actually quite early on in this planet's career that life actually evolved, just the first few 100 million years. And it took a few billion years to get going. But as time went on, it began to develop this incredible richness, this beauty and diversity that we know today. But it's only been really the last 200,000 years or so that different species arose that actually had the power collectively to impact the very nature of life on this earth. Of course, that's us, human beings. And we're all here today because we know that we've been doing a pretty lousy job of how we're impacting life on Earth, right? And we know these harbingers of a daunting future that we're all here to look at today, the wildfires, the floods, the droughts. And of course, we know that according to some people, such as the UN Secretary General, Guterres, it is too late. Like what they're saying is we need drastic action, a final warning on climate change. This warning, if you look more closely at the headline there, was given 2 years ago. What's happened in the past couple of years? Of course, just a continuation of the same devastation. And we know why. I'm sure this kind of chart is familiar to every one of you, right? This is where we're headed right now, towards a catastrophic 3 degrees or more Celsius warming this century. Even 2 degrees has been called a prescription for disaster. And the drastic changes that are needed to even get to that place are becoming less and less even realistic to consider, especially with those zones of amplifying feedback, like things like the methane that then heats, makes the global greenhouse gas emissions even worse. But here's the thing: climate change, bad as it is, frightening as it is actually only a symptom of a far deeper malaise. And that malaise is the vast ecological destruction that is taking place across the board. Just some of these statistics, kind of mind-blowing to even look at, but there's been a 69% decline in animal populations worldwide just since 1976 alone, to the last 50 years. Because of this and other factors, we're now looking at what scientists are calling the 6th great extinction of life on Earth. The other 5 were caused by sort of massive geological events. This one is caused by a single species acting consciously in what it's doing. We're looking at the virtual annihilation of coral reefs worldwide by the middle of this century. And the UN reports that 95% of Earth's land will be degraded by that time too. But really, of all the statistics that blow me away, this is the one that I just have trouble getting my head around. By 2050, at current rates, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. So we must ask ourselves, and of course everyone here does, how did we get to this crazy place, this massive destruction we're causing? And as Philip mentioned, I wrote a book some years back, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, which looked at different ways in which cultures make meaning out of the universe, from earliest hunter-gatherer days to the present day. And I'm not going to go into detail in that book right now, but there was a learning that got distilled from that book, which goes like this: that ultimately culture, a society's culture shapes values, and those values are what shape history. And by the same token, the values that we hold today are what will shape the future. So what are those values that are dominating our mainstream culture today? Well, basically, I always think this picture is kind of iconic of what our mainstream values are about, because they're based on separation. Here are these people separate from each other, connected with their technology, separate even from the food they're about to eat, not even thinking probably where it might have actually come from. And if we go like one layer deeper on that value system, it looks like something like this. This is the modern story of separation. Basically, that tells us that nature is a machine, that humans are separate from nature. The humans also are essentially selfish and competitive. And that in fact, that's great because human progress arises from the conquest of nature that we've accomplished. And the earth, the rest of life on earth, and the earth itself is really just this resource to exploit for human benefit. And underlying all of these ideas is this concept that, well, the purpose of life itself is really just to get wealthy and powerful. Now, this worldview is so pervasive today that it's easy to feel, well, isn't that just the way people think? Isn't that the way humans are or whatever? But it's a worldview that emerged in only one time and place in all of human history, in early modern Europe. And it was really well spoken by the sort of prophet of the scientific age, of the scientific revolution, Francis Bacon. And you get the sense of the excitement that was around that at that time. And they realized they had this ability to establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race itself over the universe. And we can therefore render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. So this was at the time a really exciting and stirring vision that motivated generations of white European males. And they got so much into this idea that they applied it not just to conquering nature, but really conquering other continents in the rest of the world. This image gives you this sense of this European vision of the great Spanish conquistadors and these indigenous people cowering in awe and reverence at their greatness when they land on Hispaniola or whatever it might have been. And it's because of that conquest by European white Christian males of the rest of the world that worldview of separation became the dominant worldview around the world that we experience today. And what are the impacts of that worldview? Well, basically, that worldview of separation sees nature as a resource, and it sees others as resources also, which leads to these fundamental concepts that exist throughout our world of human supremacy, this sort of moral license for human beings to do whatever they want to the rest of life on Earth. And along with that, this insidious white supremacy, this continued belief that somehow people with white skin, because of their background, where they're from, have some innate superiority over other human beings, which is still only too prevalent today. And that led to these core values of our society, our global society of extraction and exploitation, which has now manifested in what we see as global capitalism. And indeed, this is the driving force of our dominant world today. If you look, in fact, at the world's 100 largest economies, what we find is that 69 of those 100 are not even countries, nation states, but transnational corporations that control virtually every aspect of human life on Earth today. And what these corporations are driven by is the requirement for perpetual growth. You're all familiar with this concept of the S&P, whatever, price to earnings ratio, whatever. These companies, their value is based not just on what they're bringing in today to their shareholders, but what shareholders expect them to bring in 5, 10, 20 years into the future. So growth is a fundamental part of the value of those shares, which those companies are based around. It's a system that is designed brilliantly to mint billionaires. And it's led to the greatest inequality in history, where right now just the wealthiest 24 billionaires own as much wealth as half the world's population of 4 billion people. And it's a system that is inherently unsustainable. So these are its core design principles. Maximize shareholder returns, keep growing at all costs, seeing material consumption as a proxy of human welfare and seeing non-human nature as a resource to exploit. And all that leads to this extractive directive: monetize everything as fast as possible, turn humans into conditioned consumers, and exploit every available resource on Earth. So it's noting this, that, people oftentimes talk about, well, the system is broken. The system is not broken. The system is doing exactly what it was originally intended to do, to extract and exploit faster and faster indefinitely. And as proof of how well it's doing that, we can look at what scientists call the Great Acceleration. They looked at the amount of production and consumption caused by humans on the Earth ever since, what they really noticed was since the end of the Second World War, that almost every single measure you use as to how much we're producing and consuming is just continuing to explode. And it continues into the future. Mainstream economists project a tripling of global production and consumption, tripling of that level of ecological devastation just by the middle of this century, which is why so many scientists are calling out we're rapidly heading for a precipice. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Johan Rockström and the Stockholm Resilience Institute. Some years back, they tried to establish what is a safe operating space for humans on this Earth. Well, what they established was that little circle in the middle, the green. And in each of these dimensions that they measured, you'll see out of 6 of 9 of them, we have absolutely blown through that safe operating space, which is why you get these continual warnings coming from scientists. Thousands and thousands of scientists signed this statement about soon it'll be too late to move away from our failing trajectory. There's big risks, as Hans Schellenhuber, will end our civilization. And here's Antonio Guterres calling it collective suicide. So, well, is that where we're headed? Is it in fact too late? Well, part of what I looked at in this book, The Patterning Instinct, was this big arc of human history. And one thing we see from that arc is there's only been a couple of great transitions in the human experience since we first evolved as humans. And for most of our time as humans, we were nomadic hunter-gatherers. Then, beginning roughly 10,000 years ago, we began to settle, and agriculture began to emerge, which over a few thousand years got to take over the human experience with very different sets of values. And then it was only just a few hundred years ago that we saw that scientific revolution that we've mentioned arising in early modern Europe, also changing fundamentally the human experience around the world. So when people look at this century, people who studied it, the one thing that pretty much agreed on is that we are in the middle, entering right now a transition every bit as massive, as extensive as what's been experienced in these great transitions in history. The question is, where is that going to lead? Well, of course, there is that one scenario that it is too late, that we're headed for collapse, and that we'll be looking at maybe the worst case scenario, some sort of Mad Max future where it's all gone and people are like fighting each other for whatever is left. Something to be avoided at all costs, of course. Then there's another scenario which sometimes people call Fortress Earth, which I suspect might be a reason why all those billionaires and the wealthy elites who do have the power to change things aren't doing nearly as much as what we would expect. They're kind of secretly saying, well, there's kind of like a split well, they can barricade themselves off in the extreme, as Sherry mentioned, go to Mars or whatever, this absurd idea. But even on Earth, like barricade off their parts where they can enjoy all the technological excitement of AI, become neurologically enhanced humans, etc., while the rest of the Earth experiences something like that same collapse. To me, from a moral standpoint, that scenario feels even worse than the first one. Both terrible in terms of suffering, but from a moral standpoint, unacceptable. And then there is an alternative scenario. Could we, in fact, go through this transformation this century towards a future of sustainable flourishing? That's what we're going to be looking at now going forward in this presentation. Could we move towards something like an ecological civilization? So to get to that place, though, looking at what I've just been taking you through, doesn't require a few nice, good things to happen on, on some sort of superficial level. We need to change the entire operating system of our world from that extractive, exploitative capitalism to something that is more like an affirmation of life. So we can understand an ecological civilization on that basis as a transformation in the basis of our global civilization from one that's wealth-based to one that is life-based. Really, a global cultural and economic system that simply promotes sustainable flourishing for humans and Earth, with the overriding objective, really simply, to create the conditions for all people to flourish as part of a thriving, living Earth. And here's the thing about the vision of an ecological civilization. Of course, here in this room, people, a relatively small group among all the whole world of change makers who are focusing and call it this vision. But we've got to understand that this is a vision that is shared by multiple diverse groups all around the world. This move towards a life-affirming future, from indigenous models of Buen Vivir or Sumac Corset or Ubuntu in Africa, and all these community movements, whether it's permaculture, rights of nature movement, transition towns, theories of the commons, the degrowth movement, agroecology, all the spiritual drives towards it, whether it's engaged Buddhism or deep ecology or traditional Chinese principles that we have in this room manifested so strongly, Christian liberation theology, ecological economics, and then politically, we're looking at all these different movements that we know of. Every one of these groups around the world are actually, well, focusing on their things and moving towards this vision of a life-affirming future. And we can understand this vision deeper by looking at the principles of how life itself managed to evolve and be so rich on Earth. So the word ecological in civilization, I love that because it leads us to looking at how living systems self-organize. And we know that ecosystems, if left alone from human depredation, can remain resilient for millions and millions of years in spite of all the different things that might happen to it. And one of the first things we learn when we understand that is that nature is actually not selfish. What, in fact, we find is when we look at the complexity of life on Earth over as it arose over billions of years, there's only been a few major steps in that jump up in complexity to complex cells or multicellular life, simple animals or mammals. And here's the thing, every one of those came about not through increases in competition, but increases in cooperation. Life evolved through cooperation. In the words of systems biologist Lynn Margulis, life didn't take over the world by combat, but by networking. And then when we look at the rise of hominids in this incredible evolution of life, again, we find that humans didn't evolve this way because we outcompeted each other, but actually further increases in cooperation to a scale almost unseen in life. And we evolved to be that way. Millions of years ago, when early hominids, even pre-humans, found themselves on the savannah, they were vulnerable to predators. Those who learned to collaborate together were the most successful. And over the millions of years, as we became Homo sapiens, our identity expanded from self and kin to include the entire group, so that human ability to cooperate with each other, even those who are not kin, differentiates us actually from other primates. And as a result of that, we developed what social psychologists call moral emotions: compassion, guilt, shame, gratitude, embarrassment. We feel those. We don't just act morally because we think we should and we have to override our selfish nature, whatever, the way people like Richard Dawkins might say. We do it because it feels right. That is how we've evolved as human beings. And indigenous cultures have always known this and given names to it. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's called Ubuntu, which, as many of you know, translates as I am because you are. In North America, here, the Lakota tribe, for example, have this great phrase, mitakuye oyasin, which means we are all related. And they're not just talking about themselves standing there, but all of life around them, part of the same extended family. So let's look a little deeper at what these principles of ecosystems actually mean. What are these core principles, and how might they apply to human society? And I'll go into each of these one by one, or briefly. The first, probably most important one of all, is what we looked at, this mutually beneficial symbiosis, where different species learned over billions of years to work together to create this richness around us. So every time you walk into a forest, it's all around you. Plants photosynthesize, provide nourishment for other species. Insects pollinate those plants. Animals transport their seeds. Animals fertilize the soil for them. The fungus takes that and regenerates the waste into more nutrition. And these mycorrhizal networks underground even transport nutrients for the trees themselves in the forest. So this concept of symbiosis, which each party gains from a reciprocal relationship, applies equally well to human society in concepts like fairness, justice, equity, and individual dignity. And along with this is this concept of nature as a holarchy, which is that each part within the system is part of a greater whole and usually has holes within it. And from that understanding of ecosystems, we get this concept that's known as fractal flourishing, which is simply that the health of the whole system requires the flourishing of each part. Some of you may know fractals are patterns that replicate at different scales from smallest to the biggest. And it requires each of those to be healthy for the rest to be healthy. So life is not a zero-sum game the way we're told in our modern worldview. It's a positive-sum game. Along with that, another great principle is diversity. A system's health depends on differentiation and integration. Translates into human society to the inherent right of each person and community to participate in cultural, political, and economic power. Then there's balance. Every part in an ecosystem is in a harmonious relationship with the entire whole. Well, that clearly can relate to human society with a steady state economy, with equitable distribution of wealth and power. And there's grassroots self-autonomy. Like just looking literally at those grassroots right there, there's no big authority telling them this is how you're meant to grow. They've evolved that way. They do what they know is right. And because they've evolved as part of that system, it actually works for the benefit of the system too. That's that crucial concept for eco-civilization is subsidiarity, putting decision-making at the lowest possible level in the system. Then there's embeddedness, recognizing humanity as part of the natural world to tend Mother Earth rather than trying to control her. And finally, there's regeneration, sustainable flourishing into the long-term future, which is well expressed by the Constitution of the Iroquois Confederacy here in North America. In our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. So what we're looking at really is a transformation in values, an emphasis on quality of life rather than material possessions. So we progress in quality, not quantity, basing our political, social, economic choices on a sense of our shared humanity with justice and dignity for all, and building the future of civilization on symbiosis with the living earth, where the flourishing of the natural world is foundational to human flourishing. And it's helpful to look at some of these principles and look at how they contrast with the principles of our dominant society. So our dominant culture has human supremacy above all. Instead, we're looking at the intrinsic value of all life. The dominant culture sees the primacy of capital because of this philosophy of exploitation and extraction. Eco-civilization sees the primacy of human dignity. Our dominant culture is all about commoditization and homogenization of everything according to Western norms. Eco-civilization is about heterogeneity, diversity in different groups around the world. The dominant culture is all about hierarchy and what's called a wealth pump, sucking wealth from people and life on Earth to a tiny elite. And eco-civilization is about subsidiarity, pushing power back down. That rather than structural inequality, we're looking at structural equity, which involves looking at the historic patterns of injustice and transforming those. And finally, our dominant culture actually is designed to give incentives for selfish behavior, even if they're unnatural for human beings. And eco-civilization would be one designed for cooperation. And so pro-social behavior, what comes natural to us, is also what gets rewarded. So just to close, I'm going to take you through a few examples of what this might mean in practice. And when I first came across this term ecological civilization some years back, what got me so excited about it was that notion of ecological, take our principles from life. And then the civilization part, what got me was, wow, this is so big. It's not just one aspect. It's not just economics or not just changing one thing or another. It's changing everything that we call civilization. And that's why part of what I find so exciting, and this book that I'm writing right now is going to be published next spring that Philip talked about, looks at every one of these areas and shows that the great work has already been done in envisaging what's possible and actually in many cases trying it out. So these are just a taste of some of the things. We won't go into all this in detail, but just wanted to give you a sense of some of these ideas of what an ecological civilization might look like in practice. But I'll focus on a few to just give a bit of a flavor. Well, one is, of course, replacing this measure of gross domestic product as a measure of national welfare. This is this ridiculous way in which we sort of have our national scorecards, which simply measures the rate at which we're increasing the consumption and production, sucking life into the monetized economy. But there's plenty of other alternative measures out there. One of them called the genuine progress indicator, for example, factors in negatives like income inequality, environmental pollution, crime, and positives like volunteer work, household work, or education to get a much better sense of what the quality of life is like. We'd be looking at a changing framework of economics itself. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the great work of Kate Raworth and donut economics, which really simply is, we've already seen the outer layer of that donut, that ecological ceiling that we've broken through already. And Kate adds this inner layer of a social foundation, the basics that we need to allow humans to fulfill their lives with dignity and security on Earth. And really then puts economics within that donut. The goal of economics is not just to grow, but to find that safe and just space for humanity, to bring our externalities back in and set those foundations for human flourishing. Part of that, of course, is a drastic reduction in global income inequality, which would be include things like a global wealth tax, a wealth cap on billionaires and centimillionaires, and universal basic services, free universal basic services offered around the world. A big concept I just want to take you through in a little bit more depth is the commons. Now, the commons is understood really as any source of sustenance and well-being that hasn't yet been appropriated, either by the state or by private ownership. And the commons includes all of nature's amazing gifts to us. Everything, the atmosphere, fresh water, sunshine, the soil, the oceans, and also the incredible gift that our ancestors have given all of humanity for so many generations, all the way back from language, cultural traditions, technical know-how, scientific knowledge. And so this amazing richness of this commons on Earth, we can see these layered gifts, really, starting from the living Earth to language, cultural traditions, writing, civilization, specialized knowledge. More recently, things like electricity, industrialization, and global markets. And then in just very recent decades, microprocessors, computer code, internet, that is the wealth available by right to every human being born on this earth. And then some guy comes along, does a few tweaks to an algorithm, calls it Facebook, copyrights it, and all of a sudden he sucked so much of that global commons away from everybody else. So I ask you, is it not really one of the greatest examples of moral egregiousness in all of history that one person could then have sucked $180 billion of that wealth available to all of us, while half the world's population earns less than $5.50 a day, which is what's needed just to have a basic life of nutrition. So a big part of what an eco-civilization is about is recognizing that all that commons is our common wealth, that by rights is available to every one of us. And that can be shared. And one very powerful way of sharing it is known as universal basic income, also called universal basic dividend, which in some ways is a better way of describing it, because it's a dividend of that wealth, which comes in an unconditional monthly payment to every adult, sufficient to meet their basic needs. And people think, well, that can't work because everyone will get lazy, nobody will do anything. That's part of our dominant modernist worldview that is simply not right. In fact, purposeful work is an integral part of human flourishing. People have a fundamental need to feel valued by their community. They want to work pro-socially, but they can't because they are sucked into this, this capitalist system where they have to sell their hours to survive. And in fact, programs that have tried UBIs in different communities have found that consistently they report a reduction in basically every one of the bad things that leads to human distress, from malnutrition to crime to alcohol consumption, and increases in the goods: health, gender equality, school performance, and also, interestingly, entrepreneurial activity. People feel free to then be able to experiment in what they were unable to do otherwise. So turning then to these corporations that we know have so far done such a great job of destroying the earth. In an eco-civilizations, they would be existing for humanity rather than just shareholder returns. Some of you may be familiar with a Benefit Corp or B Corp certification, where a company can choose to change their charter. So they have to consider the impact of their decisions, not just on shareholders, but all these other constituencies, their workers, community, suppliers, environment. And a few companies have made that choice, but even though a few thousand companies is a great number, it's had zero impact on our world, because those big transnational corporations would never even consider for a moment to take one of these charters, because they're looking to maximize shareholder value. So in an ecological civilization, that we could see, for example, a triple bottom line required for corporate charters, not just profits, but also people and planets. Imagine a world, simple change, just sort of like the DNA of corporate law, a world where charter renewals have to occur every 5 years, and they only happen at the discretion of community-based panels. And those panels are chosen we don't look at regulators who are just part of this revolving door to join the corporation the next year after they've given them what they want. They're chosen by sortition, just like we choose jurors, to reduce that risk of corruption. So corporations, when they make their decisions, would be subject not just to financial bankruptcy, but social or environmental bankruptcy, to fundamentally transform the DNA of the decision-making process all the way through the company. So just going beyond a few other tastes, we'd be looking at a circular economy that increases employment while reducing waste, with products designed for repair and recycling, sourced from recycled materials, and waste virtually eliminated. Looking at cities designed on ecological principles, with community gardens all around, cars banned from city centers, and essential services always within a 15 or 20-minute walk, no matter where you lived in the city. Outside of the city, we'd see agroecology replacing global industrial monocrops based on permaculture, regenerative agriculture. It leads to greater crop biodiversity, water and carbon efficiency, eliminating synthetic fertilizer, and eliminating factory farming. And in fact, it's shown in studies that regenerative agriculture like this can be as productive as industrial agriculture, but without the devastating effects. And technology. Right now, our technology is controlled by these centralized corporations like Amazon, Facebook, Uber, whatever. And by by having access to that information, they get to control basically virtually every aspect of the experience of people who use that technology. In an eco-civilization, and again, these ideas are already out there being practiced, the control would be moved to the distribution of everyone who's using the actual technology. So we're talking about decentralized distributed ledger, empowering and protecting collective action, which enable people to cooperate at scale around the world for their own benefit as a community, not for the benefit of a few shareholders. And just looking more broadly at culture and community, we live right now in what Ria and Isla, somebody who spent her life studying these systems, calls domination systems with authoritarian and hierarchical social economic structures with high degrees of violence and abuse, and basically subordinating some essence of women and femininity to men and this idea of masculinity, and with beliefs and stories that justify and idealize that. So in an ecological civilization, we'd be moving towards what Rian Eisler calls a partnership system with more equitable democratic structures, mutual respect, and low degrees of violence, and equal valuing of males and females, and those attributes that are stereotypically regarded as feminine or whatever, being embraced and valued by both men and women. And from a governance point of view, we'd be looking at that subsidiarity, the decision-making pushed down to the lowest levels, but fractally leading up and up. So there'd be some level of global governance, but the power would come from below, not power imposed from above. And along with that, we'd see at the UN like a rights of nature declaration that puts the natural world in the same legal standing as humanity, with personhood given to ecosystems, rivers, high-functioning mammals, and ecocide defined as an international crime. We'd be giving back half of this earth to the rest of life. E.O. Wilson started what's called the Half Earth Initiative, along with others, to set aside half of the planet for non-human nature under the stewardship of indigenous cultures who have proven over millennia to have learned how to live in harmony with their natural surroundings. And overall, we'd be looking at building basically a planetary consciousness with a hub and spoke network of what people call a cosmo-local connection. So we'd have a place-based identity with local community focus, see each other more face-to-face, and build our own agency as community. And at the same time, we begin to build this cosmopolitan planetary consciousness. Something like Facebook would be converted to the commons, so it's available to all of us for our benefit, not for the benefit of advertisers. And there'd be a sense of global citizenship where we celebrate diversity, but recognize our deep interdependence. And over the long term, we can see from that this vision, this possibility of humanity itself becoming really like a connected superorganism, really like this emergent self-organized collective intelligence where we as humanity begin to see ourselves and the living earth as an integrated whole. The eco-philosopher Glenn Albrecht has brought up this idea of the symbiocene. So we know right now we live in the Anthropocene with the ideology of human supremacy, massive geological impact of our actions, destructive of life and biodiversity, and it's inherently unsustainable. So Glenn Albrecht talked about this vision of the symbiocene based on the principle of symbiosis for mutually beneficial flourishing of humans and living earth, where we use technology still, but for regenerative, life-affirming practices. And that could potentially be very long-lived. A civilization learning how to tend Mother Earth And if we can get to that place, then maybe in the decades and centuries to come, we can regenerate our beautiful planet. So that's the vision. Thank you so much for hearing it with me. These are the books I've written. Oh, yeah, thank you. Yes, and this, and what just before I finish, just want to mention for a moment. You'll see at the bottom there the Deep Transformation Network, which is a global network now of nearly 5,000 people around the world who looking for that sort of place of deep transformation. And together as a global community, we're exploring these pathways to an ecological civilization. So I just wanted to put out an invitation to all of you to consider joining that network. And we have monthly live meetings where we talk with leading change makers about these things and have a feed where we discuss together. So thank you. So yeah, let's open.